Good evening. It is Wednesday, March 14th, 4 p.m. here in Washington, D.C. I'm Lucy Kafanov, and you're watching RT. Well, in honor of Sunshine Week, we're dedicating today's shows to the issues of government secrecy, transparency, justice, and the rule of law. We're going to look at how transparency doesn't seem to apply to a growing list of U.S. activities. And whether it's secret prisons, torture, or drone wars, and that's just to name a few, the White House approach seems to be to stay silent and to make damn sure that others do too. As we'll discuss with Jason Leopold in just a bit, those who blow the whistle on government wrongdoing suffer dire consequences. And of course, there is always the fourth estate, but even here, it would seem that watchdogs are often drowned out by the lapdogs. Now, for this, journalists themselves are mostly to blame. The U.S. does have a questionable record, I would say, on press freedom, but it's not in dire crisis yet. I mean, it's not like journalists are regularly rounded up and thrown behind bars for doing their jobs, right? And wasn't it just a few weeks ago that Jay Carney reassured us about the president's commitment to, quote, aggressive journalism? Now, I bring these questions up because they're at the core of the case of Abdullah Haider Shai. He's an independent Yemeni journalist who's been languishing behind bars at the personal request of President Barack Obama. He's respected for his coverage of the war on terror. He's interviewed al-Qaeda leaders, including ones that the U.S. has been hunting. And he was also the first to detail the U.S. role in bombings that killed Yemeni civilians, including children, back in 2009. And while he was imprisoned on terror charges, he was pardoned after a national outcry. So why does the U.S. want him behind bars? Well, the answer of that to that is the subject of a new piece in The Nation magazine by independent journalist Jeremy Scahill. He's also the author of the book Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. He joins me from New York. Jeremy, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Why is the world superpower concerned with an independent journalist in Yemen?
Well, the United States has been waging a covert war in Yemen for a number of years. In fact, President Obama really escalated that covert war. The first bombing of Yemen that we know that President Obama authorized was on December 17th, 2009. And the way it was reported in the press was that it was a Yemeni strike and that 34 al-Qaeda members were killed in that strike. And because of this journalist, Abdullah Haider, going to the scene, taking photographs of the missile parts, and then sending them to media outlets and ultimately to Amnesty International, the world learned that, in fact, it was a U.S. bombing because they were Tomahawk cruise missiles and cluster bombs, neither of which Yemen has in its arsenal. And, of course, after Abdullah Haider revealed that, we then learned through the WikiLeaks cables that General David Petraeus, who at the time was the CENTCOM commander, had conspired with President Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen to cover up the U.S. role in those strikes. In fact, a Yemeni official said, Saleh himself told Petraeus, we'll continue to lie and say the bombs are ours and not yours. So I think that was the first incident that really put this independent journalist on Washington's radar and in their target sites.
Okay, but at the same time, this isn't the case of some Pentagon bureaucrat sort of reaching out there and trying to suppress some information. This is the President of the United States himself intervening in this case. I mean, for someone who's not familiar necessarily with the story, that would lead people to think that this guy must have done something really bad. What evidence does the U.S. have in requiring that he remains behind bars?
Right. So what Abdullah Haider was famous for in Yemen was doing interviews with people that were on the U.S. hit list, the leaders of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and also with a U.S. citizen named Anwar al-Awlaki, who, of course, was assassinated last September in a U.S. drone strike in Yemen. Abdullah Haider interviewed Anwar al-Awlaki a number of times. In fact, he was the first journalist to interview him after the Fort Hood shooting, where Major Nidal Hassan gunned down more than a dozen of his fellow soldiers in Fort Hood, Texas. And in fact, if you read the transcript or you watch the interview that Abdullah Haider did with Anwar al-Awlaki, it's a very critical interview, and it reads like an interview of an objective journalist who was pressing al-Awlaki with hard questions. In fact, one of the pieces of evidence, I mean, you can't really call it that because al-Awlaki was only convicted in the court of public opinion, never in court. But one of the things that was cited by the pro-assassination punditry were comments that al-Awlaki had made to Abdullah Haider praising Nidal Hassan's killing of these soldiers. I bring that up because Abdullah Haider was well known in the international press corps. He had worked with the Washington Post. He had been cited by the New York Times and ABC News as an al-Qaeda expert. And so what I think the White House was concerned about is like al-Awlaki, they wanted to silence him. I think that that they were concerned that this was a guy who was telling al-Qaeda's side of the story, and they wanted it shut down. And what's most outrageous for me as an American journalist is the role of the U.S. Because what happened, Lucy, is that Abdullah Haider was tried in a secret court in Yemen that international legal organizations have said is illegal and doesn't ensure due process. It was set up to go after journalists who criticized the regime. He had fabricated evidence produced against him. He did not present a defense because he did not recognize the legitimacy of the court, and Human Rights Watch and other organizations criticized that court. He gets convicted. He was, by the way, charged with some crimes that carried the death penalty. But because everyone in Yemen knew the whole thing was a sham and a setup, he got a relatively light sentence, 5 years. Ali Abdullah Saleh, the president of Yemen, is then approached by very important figures in Yemen, among them tribal leaders who really run the show there, and they said, you got to release this guy. So Saleh says, okay, I'm going to pardon him. He has the pardon prepared, ready to sign it. It leaks out to the Yemeni press, and Ali Abdullah Saleh gets a phone call, not from John Brennan or one of Obama's advisors, but from President Obama himself. And President Obama said, we're very concerned about the release of this guy. We don't know the full extent of what happened in that phone call, but the White House and State Department, in fact, I interviewed the State Department, admit that Obama, in fact, said the U.S. wants him to stay in jail. And so the pardon was rescinded, and he continues to rot away in a prison after having been convicted in a kangaroo court. And he's in prison because Barack Obama wants him in prison.
I mean, it sounds outrageous, Jeremy, and the question that comes to mind is why we haven't heard about this earlier. I mean, we remember what happened when Iranian-American journalist Roxana Saberi was imprisoned in Iran. It was a huge media outcry. Laura Ling and Yoona Lee in North Korea, huge media outcry. Why are we not hearing about this here in the U.S., especially in light of the fact that the Committee to Protect Journalists and Amnesty International, major groups have spoken out about this? Why isn't the media covering it here?
I think part of it has to do with the sort of institutional racism that has really come to the fore. If his name was, William Smith Kennedy, and he was a white man, and he had been arrested on these charges, instead of being Abdullah Haider Shea, a Muslim journalist. So I think part of it is just the fact, the unfortunate nature of his national identity. He's a Yemeni and he's a Muslim. But more to the point, I think it's that a lot of journalists are afraid to speak out on behalf of someone that has been accused of being pro-Al-Qaeda or being an Al-Qaeda spokesperson. I've talked with numerous people, journalists, former State Department officials, people who knew Abdullah Haider, and they said this is complete nonsense, that his journalism, if anything, was the number one reason why we know anything at all about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And so I think it's a combination of racism and the fact that people are terrified right now of speaking out in defense of anyone accused of these kinds of terrorism-related charges. Look at how long it took for the Guantanamo prisoners to get any kind of representation from human rights groups. Only the Center for Constitutional Rights and the UK group Reprieve would dare to defend Guantanamo prisoners early on. Everyone else was terrified. It's a part of the climate of fear that we're in, and it's particularly shameful of media outlets that used Abdullah Haider to get their scoops to be completely silent about his imprisonment. They have an obligation to this man to speak out on his behalf and demand answers from the White House.
Well, we'll see, I guess, if the coverage picks up at all after today and after the release of your piece. But, another thing that I have to ask is, do you think, is this an isolated incident, or is this something that could be the beginning, perhaps, of a crackdown on more than just some brown guy in Yemen? Could journalists like yourself, like myself, like other independent reporters be affected by this? Is this a trend?
Well, I think that his case is an extreme one where you have a journalist actually being railroaded and then locked away in prison. What I'm more concerned about for American journalists, for British journalists, but particularly American journalists, is that in this culture where this administration is going after whistleblowers in an unprecedented way, we all have an obligation to protect our sources. I have to say that I myself am really nervous about the safety of some of the people that I talk to. I'm not saying that they're going to be bumped off or something, but their safety legally, because this administration seems intent on going after whistleblowers. And so, as a journalist that covers national security, I'm talking all the time with people that work in the intelligence and the military community. It has sent shockwaves through that community. And so we as journalists have to be really sort of vigilant in protecting our sources. Jim Risen from the New York Times, for instance, they're going after him right now because of this case involving Thomas Drake, the alleged NSA leaker. Other journalists are facing threats of subpoenas. People's Twitter accounts are being subpoenaed. So I think there's a general climate of fear that exists now in the world of national security journalism. I'm more concerned about sources than I am journalists being prosecuted right now. I'm concerned about the fate of whistleblowers talking to journalists and the effect that that's going to have on a democratic society when people can't speak out on wrongdoings involving the government without fear of very, very serious punishment.
It just seems really ironic to me because there's this case of the U.S. going after this guy essentially because their argument is he's somehow boosting terrorism against the United States, whereas, as you've covered in Yemen, our drone strikes, our policies, there's specific actions that the U.S. is conducting right now that is, in fact, fueling terrorist sentiment against the U.S. abroad.
Right. I mean, that's a great point. But here I think we have what sort of captures the big hypocrisy of this all is that you have people like Fran Townsend, the former Bush counterterrorism advisor, Ed Rendell, the former governor Tom Ridge, the former governor of Pennsylvania, former head of Homeland Security, Howard Dean, the former governor of Vermont, and a very prominent Democrat. These guys are all being advocates right now for the MEK. The State Department designated terrorist group, and they're all working for them to try to get them lifted off of this terrorism list. So they're allowed to walk around advocating for a group that the State Department has identified as terrorists. But Abdullah Haider Shah, this journalist in Yemen, he committed the crime of exposing a U.S. bombing that killed civilians and interviewing someone who happens to be a U.S. citizen that the U.S. wanted to be silenced and wanted to assassinate, and he gets locked away in prison. So the message there is that there are sort of good terrorists and bad terrorists. And if you're a former official of the Democratic or Republican Party, you're allowed to advocate for people that are State Department designated terrorists. But if you're a journalist, you're not allowed to interview them. That's chilling, and it has chilled the scene in Yemen among journalists. Journalists are terrified right now to interview these people, and ultimately it hurts the U.S. counterterrorism effort because you need to understand the mentality of the people that you claim to be fighting, or you're never going to be able to address the problem you say you're fighting to wipe out. So, I mean, I think even from a conventional, even if you accept the framework of this global so-called war on terror, and you're a supporter of these drone strikes, you have just taken away one of your best opportunities to gather intelligence on the ground by putting in jail Abdullah Haider Shah.
Well, it's an outrageous case, Jeremy. I know you're not the only one who's been covering it, but we'll see how this story plays out, and hopefully it'll get some much-needed attention right here in the U.S. Thank you so much for your time, as always. That was Jeremy Scahill, journalist for The Nation and the author of Blackwater. All right, well, from silencing critics abroad to silencing those right here at home, President Obama promised transparency when he came into office. Today, his administration is increasingly regarded as the worst